Hi, Elvin. Thank you for joining us today. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce you to Elvin Turner. Elvin is the author of Be Less Zombie: How Great Companies Create Dynamic Innovation, Fearless Leadership, and Passionate People. He's also an advisor with ETA Limited and an associate professor with Latam Business School. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you. I would like to kick it off by asking you, what inspired you to write the book, and how did you get started in this area of innovation?
Great. Well, great to be here. Thank you, David. Well, so first question, how did I get started in innovation? Well, for about 20 years or so, I worked for a management consultancy that focused on innovation, change, and leadership. And eventually I ended up heading up the innovation space. And that was generally working with large organizations, often going and doing placements in there and trying to help stimulate a culture of innovation, putting in processes and building capabilities in that way. And then about 4 years ago, I decided to set up on my own. There were some different things that I wanted to do. I never really actually intended to write a book, but there was an annoyance, I guess, that I was finding at the end of assignments that I was working with clients, and whether it was with senior executives and helping them create this framework and culture and ecosystem of innovation, or it was working on a leadership development program. Sooner or later, the assignment ends. And I always wanted to be able to leave behind or recommend something that would be the field guide, that can help them say, oh, when we did that thing, what was that model again? Or what was that story? And I just, despite the fact there are so many great innovation books out there, there wasn't anything that I felt I could recommend that looked at innovation strategy, that looked at process, that looked at culture, that looked at leadership in a very practical, non-jargony way that people could just pick up, dip in, dip out in the way that people do with business books. So that was really the motivation to write it. And I guess the feedback so far seems to be validating that, and people seem to be finding that that's actually really what it's very useful for. So that's my background, really.
Well, that's pretty interesting, because that kind of dovetails with the same experience that, brought us to write our book, which hopefully we'll have similar success with down the road once it hits the press.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting. The consulting gigs are always that there's nothing left behind. It's sort of like, here, let me watch me fish. Here's the fish. Go cook it and eat it. And by the way, call me if you need another one.
Yeah.
It's very dissatisfying. So when you started looking at putting this together, were you looking at more, I think I'll write the book, then I'll do teaching on it? What sort of is the process to sort of increase the network, if you will, of people to adopt sort of the process that you're after?
Well, I mean, it's been very interesting. So the book came out right at the beginning of COVID lockdown. All of the bookshops shut. So I've got one picture of an airport in the UK with Be Less Zombie number 10, and then they all closed. and then I was kind of left with I had to move on emotionally, I guess, being really honest, because there's a year of work putting that book together. And then suddenly I'm thinking, have I just launched a book at the worst possible time in history to launch a book? Because no one's going to buy it. And, business books are down 60%, I'm told. Actually, I'm not allowing that to bother me, because, a business book has got a long tail. But what it actually provoked the same question in me, actually, which was, well, what am I going to do? I've got all of these ideas here that I want to share with people. Are they now not going to get out? So what I ended up doing was creating a free video course, 30 videos, where I'm basically giving away a load of the ideas for free in the book. Not all of it, but some stuff just to help you get moving with some of the process stuff. And try to do what I can to get the stuff out there. And the reason I wrote the book in the first place is I genuinely want to see organizations not only doing more, better innovation, but the people inside the organizations actually enjoy their work as well. And that motivation doesn't go away just because the book isn't necessarily available in the local bookstore. So it did prompt me to think, okay, I need to innovate myself here. If I believe in this message and I believe that it's genuinely helpful, what can I do? So it's kind of out there for free, parts of it at least at the moment. That's kind of was my response.
Yeah, I've been through the course, and it's very good. So you've done a great job, and I think that's a great way for you to, like you said, put your ideas out there, and also helps promote the book So one thing that I discovered about Elvin is that he is multi-talented. So I found out in previous discussions with him that he designed his own cover for his book. And he has also produced his own videos, which, I've looked at your videos. They're very well done. So, we talk about innovation. And in our book, we talk about people that are polymath. They're able to bring ideas from different domains and put them together in unique ways. And that leads to innovation. So it seems to me that you have a little bit of that in you, Elvin. So tell me a little bit more about that.
I'm not going to claim to be a polymath by any means. I guess I've had a very interesting career. The company that I worked for 20 years went through many iterations in its own right. And I started out actually as a speechwriter in there, writing speeches for politicians and business leaders and ghostwriting articles. That then led on to, I was working in change management a lot at the time when video as an internal communications tool was important. So I trained as a film producer, I guess. I did all the professional training with it as a cameraman, as an editor, as a director and producer. That was great fun. Did lots of interesting stuff, corporate video for a while. And then and those were kind of like side gigs to the main work that I was actually doing. So I was always wondering, how's this video and speech writing and stuff ever going to converge and show up in the future? And I guess right now it kind of is. It's the writing, it's the innovation, it's the leadership consulting, it's the change in the video. And I guess I'm just trying to pull it all together to make maximum use. But it's been a different kind of journey, really. Yeah.
Okay.
We talk about the convergence of technologies creating new ecosystems and disrupting different things. It also applies over in the leadership side, where you look at something called range, which is the ultimate complement to a generalist, right? So converging all of these different things, and then what we used to call in the military, bringing everything to the tip of the spear. So it's interesting that in your career you've done this. What are some of the things that you think belong at that point? These are the most important things that you've discovered, not only in managing your career, but also influencing the behaviors of those in your clients.
Well, it's interesting. And the last 6 chapters in the book focus on the role of leadership in trying to create a culture of innovation more deliberately. And one of those chapters is really looking at what I call the half-life of leadership skills and experience, the things that got us to where we are, the superpowers that we've developed over our careers. Are they the ones that are really going to be the ones that help us move forward into the future and navigate greater uncertainty? And I guess none of us are going to be too surprised to hear the answer is generally no. And when you look around at the way that leadership teams are organizing themselves and aligning their time against value creation, I see a big gap and a big requirement for more focus on the ability to really design and deliver. Well, let's say design, architect, and curate an environment where digital business models can show up more effectively. And at the moment, I see capability gaps in many leaders in that area, because that's kind of IT will look after that. Someone in technology will look after that. Well, no, I think the world has moved on. And whilst those standard business skills that got us to where we are still important, there's another layer that I feel that many leaders are opting out of, or not necessarily appreciating enough, that they're going to be really important in helping us remain relevant in the future. So what decisions do we need to make today about our own leadership, our own capabilities and experience, so that we show up in the future? And having some brave conversations around, are we the team that actually is able to get us there? And if we're not, should some of us step aside, or should we look to partner with other people in the organization, hire different kinds of people in? So that whole thing around the stewardship of the future and the decisions that we need to make now, not just about the business, but about the people leading the business, I think is a really difficult issue to grapple with, but it's one of the biggest elephants in the room, I think.
Yeah. So Elvin, let's talk a little bit about strategy. So, we have developed a methodology called SPX, which stands for Strategic Planning for the Exponential Era. And the idea is that things are changing extremely fast. So the process of developing 5-year plans don't apply to this environment anymore. And this ties right in with the whole idea of being innovative and being able to do things in a much faster pace. So tell us a little bit about, your thoughts on companies that are trying to build strategies and are trying to be innovative in this new world of fast changes.
Certainly. So I'd say that the two most common statements I hear when I meet a leader for the first time are, first of all, I'm a consultant that walks through the door and they know I'm going to be trying to sell them something. At least that's their expectation. It's, listen, don't tell me why we need to innovate. Don't tell me what we need to innovate. Just tell us how. It keeps slipping through our fingers, and you dig a bit deeper and say, okay, well, what's the real issue here? Well, there's not enough innovation going on. Okay, I know that's not actually the issue. Okay, so there's no innovation going on at all. Well, actually, there's loads of innovation going on. What we haven't got is big ideas. I open the big idea cupboard. There's nothing in there. Where's the big, where are the big ideas? And that usually starts a conversation around, well, big ideas require a very different environment to show up than the status quo. The status quo means that anything that is born into the environment that looks anything different from today has a neat place to put it. It's kind of dead on arrival. It's got no budget. It's got no team. It's got nowhere to play. So you have to be deliberate about creating an environment where these ideas that aren't showing up can show up. Well, what does that look like? And that's the beginning of a conversation about being more deliberate rather than just, that's the thing. I feel we're very, many organizations are very casual about innovation. It's a very campaign-led approach. It's not a commitment. It's not, this has to be woven into our being so that it's an inevitability that innovation shows up, not it's an argument every time. So when I'm talking to organizations about strategy, often, this desire for the how, as soon as you show a pathway of how innovation can be structured, it's not black box. It's something that you can run just like any other part of the business. You can have a strategy around it. Suddenly I see often a sigh of relief, like, oh, okay, I can do this. We can put projects around this. We can apply the skills that we already have to developing an innovation strategy, which has metrics and measures and process and structure and ways of working that we can measure if we want to. So I often find that the starting point is helping a leader understand the need for an innovation strategy and what one is, as opposed to just strategy, because I think sometimes there's confusion between the two, the corporate strategy and the innovation strategy.
I think that's an interesting path to go down. I know from personal experience that until we built an innovation team, a group that was actually budgeted, focused on taking the ideas, sorting them, and doing something, we really didn't see those things surface. But going back to a couple of things, you mentioned passion and you mentioned courage. And those are two big things that we say that performance is the residual of behaviors. So if you don't get the right behaviors, you won't get the right performance. The other problem that you have is if you focus strictly on performance, the variable becomes behaviors, and then you get things like an Enron. So in your experience of working with different clients and getting to this innovation, where do you see the roles of leadership when it comes to developing the passion and actually having the courage to take the steps to make the innovation process like breathing or like any other part of the organization?
Well, it ends up usually the way that I'm brought into an organization, this isn't the first thing that gets talked about, but it becomes an interesting and important side product, and that's employee engagement. And I'm sure you've probably been in the same situation. You run a workshop where you're helping people engage with innovation, say it's an idea sprint or something. And I very often will get people coming to me at the end of the day saying, oh, that was really great, really enjoyed the process. But you know what? This today has reminded me why I got into this business in the first place. It's like, come on, we're building the future and we're reminding ourselves who the customers are. There is such an important benefit to involve people in innovation. And when leaders observe that, I found that's one of the fastest ways to help them see, hang on a minute, this innovation thing has got a lot of useful side benefits. So I think helping a leader see that is one thing. I guess the other thing around it, and it's a challenge that I'll often put to a leader is, where does your desire for risk-taking compete with or conflict with the decisions that tomorrow needs you to make today? So I was working with a defense organization this week. And I put the question to them, are you more afraid of the personal risk facing you over the future of national security? Is your desire to stay safe putting the safety of the rest of us at risk to some degree? Because actually the ability of our competitors to catch up with us and overtake us in some areas is directly related to our ability to pursue more disruptive innovation. And if we just coast and do incremental innovation, there are people out there who are desperate to overtake. So that whole thing around how do we build courage into people so that they can take those risks? For me, I really like what Astro Teller talks about at Google X. He says, we build the path of least resistance for bold ideas to show up. And I think that's a useful framework for any group of leaders to say, okay, in our context, how would we design that path of least resistance? What would need to be true culturally? And therefore, from a leadership point of view, from a process, how do we lower the stakes so that people feel safe to step forward? And I think that's the game changer. I really do. As soon as the stakes are lowered, people feel free to, or freer to take the risks with the ideas that we're saying that we need more of, but they're just not showing up.
Yeah, crossing that threshold of courage, because there is one, and I think culturally we build the threshold, and where we set that threshold allows the courage to either flow or not flow. It's somewhat like trust. If you don't have trust between individuals and organizations, the future doesn't flow.
Yeah,
the future can't happen because there's no trust to make anything happen. So I find that interesting. That again, a lot of this stuff always comes back to culture, and that brings up another angle on strategy. Is strategy really philosophy?
I need to have a think about that. No one's ever asked me that question before. I guess strategy is a hypothesis about the future, so which we know less and less about whether it will come true the further we go from the future. So I guess you could say it's a form of philosophy.
Yeah, so that's a great segue to testing that hypothesis. So in your book, you talk about running experiments, right? Which is something that we encourage our clients to do as well. We talk about it in SPX. So talk a little bit about that process of running low risk experiments.
So we talked about lowering the stakes, and I think probably one of the most important ideas in the last 10 years came out of Eric Ries's book, The Lean Startup. I know it was built on other people's work, but the way that he articulated it kind of set something on fire. And I found that one of the most effective ways to lower the stakes, to lower the risks of innovation, particularly pursuing the more unknown ideas and the bolder ideas, is to run experiments. So for anyone listening that this is new for, you take your idea, and that idea is based on assumptions that need to be true in order for it to work. And we're often in such a rush to build the idea, we haven't yet tested the assumptions upon which need to be true in order for it to work. So that the idea around experimentation is identifying what are those assumptions that matter most, the leap of faith assumptions that would have a huge impact if they turned out to be a huge impact on the success, but we're least certain about whether they're true. So the idea is you find your most important assumptions and you test them really quickly, really cheaply. Now, I found that this is the key to democratizing innovation in so many organizations, because it works at two levels. One, you give people simple tools to go away and start, instead of spending $50K on a prototype, you're spending $50 on testing an assumption. And then you're looking at the data and saying, what does that inform us and what we should do next? Should we continue? Should we pivot? Should we ditch it now? And we're learning very quickly whether we should unlock more resource or actually leave it quickly, move on to the next thing. So again, it's the Google X way of working. It's find as quickly as you can which ones are wrong. But what that does is it really builds confidence in a team around a simple process of how to do this effectively at speed and make progress. But it also then empowers leaders and managers with data that helps them make decisions that are not just based on gut feeling and intuition and pet projects, is actually based on more objective data. So suddenly the stakes are much lower, the confidence levels are higher. And I've just seen it time and time again inside organizations. When you unlock the power of experimentation, everything seems to rise. And for me, that's really important for two things. One is you finally got some stuff moving and you're playing with ideas that seem to be more risky. But the second thing is then it often sparks an appetite for a more strategic conversation about innovation with leaders who have now seen, hang on, we can make this thing work without people getting killed. Okay, tell me more. And that's been a really helpful dynamic I've found. So yeah, I mean, for me, I worked with an organization recently, and the CEO said to me, what I've started doing now, I don't ask for people to bring me ideas. I ask them to bring me experiments, because ideas are 10 a penny. Bring me an experiment with some data and I'll listen. And I thought that was a really healthy flip to make.
It really
Yeah,
is. We
absolutely.
look at experimentation as the Kickstarter for the flywheel,
Yeah, I love that.
right? It just, you start this one, then we have another one, then we have another one. There's a process that and we don't want to go into that here, but it's interesting because that's the same starting point.
Yeah.
Experimentation is a very common, theme, but bringing that threshold down to where people will jump into it and making them realize that you can do it on $50, not 50,000.
Yeah.
The other thing is the assumptions piece. That's been studied for quite some time. The ramifications of assumptions. They influence all kinds of things. You assume the selling price was, you assume the cost was, you assume the adoption rate was, you assume the market was malleable. When you look at those testing the assumptions, are there 3 or 4 that are on the critical path?
Well, I'm going to pick one, if you don't mind, which is usually the one. I mean, it depends on what it is. If you look, so, there's the IDEO work that around design thinking, desirability, feasibility, and viability. And depending on what you're working on, one of those will matter most. But if it's developing a new product or a new version of something, I think desirability is number one. To what extent do people want this enough that they will pay to change their behaviors? Which is ultimately what it comes down to. It's very easy for someone to say, yeah, I'll buy that. And then you put it in front of them. And of course, they don't show up because it wasn't quite how they imagined it, or, well, it's important, but not that important. So testing the desirability. And then, more research out this week, I saw, guess what? Number one reason why startups fail, selling something no one wants. So getting to the heart of desirability, because for me, innovation often is all about the design of behavior change. Ultimately helping someone do something different for a better outcome. And our ability to anticipate that is generally pretty weak, I think, for lots of different reasons. So I would say experiments that help us flush out, does anybody even care enough about this first, is a really big deal. I would say that one if I had to pick one.
All right, so we have come to the end of our 20-minute time frame here. So before we close, Elvin, any final thoughts that you'd like to leave for companies that are trying to introduce innovation processes into their environment? And then let our audience know how they can get a hold of you and get more information about the book and about the things that you're working on.
Okay, yeah. Okay, 2 quick thoughts. So the first one comes from the world of coaching. When we're looking at innovation as a company, as an individual even, ask yourself the question, what can I control? What can I influence? What do I have to accept? And it works at 2 levels for me with innovation. If you're at the board level, you've got control over pretty much everything. I would strongly encourage you to start looking at being more deliberate about how you structure innovation through a strategic approach. Get an innovation strategy. There's tons of resources out there that can help you do that, but you have to be deliberate. You can't expect big ideas just to show up on their own. They just won't. They'll die before they've got anywhere. That'll be the first thing. If you're lower down in the organization and you're frustrated and you're in a team, again, control, influence, accept. What can you control? What you can certainly control is your ability to learn how to run experiments. So I would strongly suggest equip yourself, tons of resources online. Google the lean startup. You will find a whole community out there desperate to teach you how to do this stuff, or my book or David's book. So learn experimentation, start to put it into practice, help the process of developing ideas feel safe for your boss. That's often what it comes down to, so that they feel safe in sponsoring something better. Pay as you go, small steps to lower the stakes of innovation. You'll find that people will start looking over the dividers in the office. What are those guys doing over there? And it will develop a life of its own, because you're dreaming big, you're starting small. So what can you control? What can you influence? What do you need to accept? focus on what you can control, you can usually do something good from where you're sitting. So if people want to get hold of me, best place really is elvinturner.com. You get links there to the free course that we talked about, contact details, you can get in touch, and there's more details about the book.
Very good. Thank you very much, Elvin. It was a great pleasure to have you here on the webcast. Looking forward to our continued relationship. Thank you again.
Yeah, well, thank you both, David and Michael, and I wish you all the best with your book as well.
Thank you.